Welcome back to the Unseen Wisdom, everybody.
It's great to be back.
If you're enjoying these deep dives into the news, you know what to do. Hit that like button, leave us a comment, and, of course, subscribe.
Yeah, subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes.
That's right. Today, we're looking into a story that's been making headlines.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the legal battles of Yakhe Kwinana, the former SAA board member.
Right, and for this deep dive, we've got a few sources lined up.
Right.
We've got some news coverage from SABC and ENCA, particularly their reports on Ms. Kwinana's recent bail application, which you can find on YouTube.
Okay.
We also pulled some excerpts from the court transcripts.
It seems like this bail application is related to charges of extortion and malicious damage to property.
Exactly, and we're aiming to really break down what happened during this hearing.
And as many of you probably know, this isn't the first time Ms. Kwinana has been in the news because of legal issues.
Right, there were those previous fraud allegations tied to her time at SAA.
Yeah, it's all very complicated.
Very much so.
Today, we want to help you understand the arguments presented in court, the evidence they talked about, and Ms. Kwinana's own perspective from the proceedings and the later interview.
Sounds good. Let's dive right in.
Let's get into it.
Starting with those charges. The first one, extortion.
Okay.
Now, if we go by Ms. Kwinana's testimony, this charge comes from an agreement she had with people living on her farm in East London, Bongweni.
Oh, I see.
It was about paying rent.
Right.
She insisted that it wasn't some shady demand. It came out of a proper meeting where they agreed on rent.
Okay, so she's saying it was legitimate.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets interesting.
Oh.
She brings up a ruling from a harassment court.
Okay.
This court said these people on her farm were illegal occupiers and ordered them to pay a hefty sum, like 70,000 Rand every month.
Wow.
So she's puzzled how an agreement to pay rent, especially after this court ruling, is now being called extortion.
That is strange. So what's the takeaway from this extortion charge?
Well, I guess it shows that the same facts can be seen in totally different ways, depending on, the legal angle.
Yeah. Ms. Kwinana sees it as a legitimate agreement, especially with that court ruling. But the state, they see it as possibly unlawful, maybe coercive?
So it comes down to context and how the law is interpreted.
Absolutely.
Moving on to that second charge, malicious damage to property.
Right.
It looks like Ms. Kwinana's defense hinges on a 2020 eviction order.
Can you explain that a little?
Sure. It's actually quite simple.
Okay.
Ms. Kwinana is saying that the 2020 court order specifically told her to demolish and remove any structures on the farm.
I see.
So her logic is, if the court orders a demolition, then any damage during that process can't be considered malicious. It was a direct result of a legal order.
That makes sense, at least on the surface.
Yeah.
But then we hear about a 2024 interim interdict.
Right.
How does that complicate things?
Well, this interdict from 2024 was basically a temporary order to stop any further demolitions on the property. The legal question is, did this newer temporary order override the original 2020 demolition order?
I get it.
The defense is arguing that it didn't, that the 2020 order was still valid.
But what about the state?
They seem to be saying any demolitions after the 2024 interdict could be considered malicious, because there was a legal instruction to stop.
So the timing of these orders and their legal weight are really important here.
Exactly. It's all about legal precedence.
Let's move on to Ms. Kwinana's bail application. What were her main arguments for release?
Okay, well, one thing she kept saying was that these charges are, what did she call them?
Frivolous, I believe.
Yeah, frivolous without merit.
Right.
She said she's confident she can prove her innocence without a doubt.
That's a pretty bold statement at this stage.
It really is. It shows she thinks she has a strong defense, that the evidence will clear her.
For sure.
She also brought up some health concerns, which, is common in these kinds of applications.
Makes sense.
What did she tell the court?
She said she has shortness of breath, particularly in stressful situations or, if there's smoke around.
Oh.
She also mentioned having dizzy spells while she was in jail.
It's understandable that being detained can be stressful and might make existing health problems worse.
Definitely.
Now, she also had to address whether she was a flight risk or a danger to witnesses.
Those are always key questions in these hearings.
Absolutely. What was her response?
She assured the court that she has absolutely no plans to run away and she doesn't have the ability or desire to harm the public or intimidate witnesses.
Okay.
And to prove her point, she confirmed that the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, has her passport.
So they've got her passport. That makes it harder to run.
Exactly. And the court often considers that.
What about money? Did she talk about bail?
Yeah, she did. She said her finances are limited and she can only afford 2,000 Rand for bail.
That doesn't seem like much, especially given her past positions.
True.
She also mentioned that her husband would be the one to pay it. Now, another interesting point is that her legal team mentioned community members were ready to testify that there was a mutual agreement to pay rent.
Oh, so they're backing up her story.
Yeah, how important is that to her defense against the extortion charge?
Well, that could be huge.
Okay.
It challenges the idea that she forced anyone into anything. It suggests it was a consensual agreement about the rent.
So if those witnesses back up her story, the extortion charge might not hold up.
Exactly. It could be a turning point.
Right. Now, let's look at how the state responded to all of this and what evidence they brought in.
Sounds good.
First up, Warrant Officer Rodney Javen, the arresting officer.
Okay.
What was his version of the arrest?
Well, he talked about arresting Miss Kwinana at her home in Blue Valley Estate in Centurion. This was on March 17th.
Okay.
He said they brought in a tactical response team because Miss Kwinana had her own security detail, which they thought posed a risk.
Interesting. That paints a different picture from what she said.
It does.
There also seems to be disagreement about whether she knew the police were coming. What did Javon say about that?
He said that the estate security took their information and told the tenant before taking them to Miss Kwinana's house. But she claims she wasn't told beforehand, which would explain why she was scared and thought she was being kidnapped.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
It really changes how we see her reaction during the arrest.
Absolutely.
Speaking of which, their descriptions of what the police were wearing were completely different.
Oh, yeah.
What did Javon remember?
He said he was in uniform and the rest of the team were in full tactical gear, helmets and rifles, standard for a tactical response.
Okay.
But Miss Kwinana remembers it differently.
How so?
She said they were wearing navy clothes, had balaclavas on, and no clear police markings, which obviously would make anyone scared.
Yeah, that would be terrifying.
Definitely.
And how did Javon describe her behavior?
He said she got riotous and hysterical, and she resisted arrest so much that they had to restrain her. He even said she grabbed a table and started shouting.
Wow, that's a far cry from her explanation.
Yeah. She said she resisted because she was afraid, especially because of how they were dressed and because she wasn't warned.
It's amazing how different people can perceive the same event.
It really is.
Javon also said that he informed her of her rights.
What did he say about that?
He said he told her about her rights both at the scene and after they left her house. He also mentioned that because she was initially quiet, they thought she was exercising her right to remain silent.
So the state's trying to show that they followed the law and respected her rights.
It seems like their questioning of Javon was mainly to counter Miss Kwinana's version of events.
Definitely, and ultimately the state wants to keep her detained because they believe it's important for the legal process.
Okay, so that's the state side. Now, what about the defense? How did they respond?
They were pretty critical of how the state was handling things.
In what way?
Well, they accused the state of asking the same questions over and over, focusing on things that weren't even being disputed, wasting everyone's time.
It sounds like they wanted to move things along and focus on the important legal issues.
Right.
What about the 2020 eviction order? What was their position on that?
They were adamant that it was still valid, that the 2024 interdict didn't change that.
Okay, so that's a big part of their argument against the property damage charge.
Exactly. They're saying those demolitions happened because a court order told her to do them.
And they went even further, right?
Yeah, they suggested that the people who complained might be in the wrong themselves.
How so?
They said those people might actually be in contempt of court if they stayed on the land or built things after the eviction order was issued.
So they're turning it around, making it seem like the alleged victims broke the law.
Exactly.
The defense also didn't like that 2024 interdict, did they?
No, they didn't. They called it Exhibit B and said it wasn't legally sound. They argued that the state couldn't use it to say the demolitions were malicious.
So they're saying the state's case about the property damage doesn't hold up.
Basically.
It sounds like they're picking apart the state's case bit by bit.
That's a good way to put it.
Did they have any other issues with how things were handled?
Yes. They said Miss Kwinana wasn't properly informed that she had to go to the Randburg court instead of directly to the Eastern Cape, where the case started.
Ah, so they're saying there might have been some miscommunication, some problems with the process.
Right.
They also made some serious accusations against the investigating officers, didn't they?
They did.
What were they?
They said the officers weren't cooperative, even that they were arrogant. But the bigger accusation was that the first investigating officer, Mr. Limo, admitted he wanted to punish Mrs. Kwinana.
If that's true, that's a huge problem. You'd mean the investigation wasn't fair.
Absolutely.
Lastly, the defense talked about that previous fraud charge.
What did they say about it?
They clarified that this bail application is specifically for the extortion and property damage charges.
Right.
They mentioned that there's a pending objection to the fraud charge scheduled for April, just to keep the focus on the current issues.
Makes sense. To support their case, they also brought in an attorney as a witness.
Okay, what did the attorney say?
Well, their testimony supported what the defense had said about their talks with the investigating officers. They confirmed that they initially thought Ms. Kwinana was supposed to appear in court on Wednesday.
Got it.
They also talked about how hard it was to reach the prosecutor and the investigating officer, which backs up the defense's claim that they weren't being cooperative.
And the attorney also talked about that allegation of bias, right?
Yes, they brought a statement that Mr. Lemo, the first investigator, allegedly made. It suggested that he was biased and wanted to punish Mrs. Kwinana.
So the offense used that as evidence to cast doubt on the fairness of the whole investigation.
Exactly.
What about all those legal arguments about the court orders? Did the attorney go into that?
Oh yeah, they went over the legal points again, stressing that the 2020 demolition order was still valid, that the interdict didn't change that.
Okay, again, that's key to their defense against the property damage charge.
Right. They also mentioned that they plan to challenge a supplementary affidavit in the related civil case. They're arguing that the people who filed that affidavit are in contempt of the 2020 order.
Wow, it's complicated how all these legal proceedings are connected.
Very much so.
And did the attorney address the alleged rent agreement?
Yes. They said they know of witnesses who would testify about the agreed-upon rent payments.
So they're building on Ms. Kwinana's defense against extortion, suggesting it was all agreed upon.
Exactly. And to wrap up their testimony, the attorney clarified the difference between the initial charge, failure to disclose a conflict of interest, and the current fraud charge, reminding everyone that that's a separate issue that's being challenged in court.
So it seems like the defense was trying to paint a picture of Ms. Kwinana acting within the law, following a valid court order. They're implying that the current charges are based on misunderstandings, or maybe even bad intentions.
Yeah, they even brought in a community member to testify.
Oh, right. What did that person have to say?
They said they'd been living on the farm since 2019,
Okay.
and that they were initially told the land was the soil of God before they found out who owned it.
Interesting.
They also described going to community meetings where they talked about that 2020 eviction order.
Okay.
And this is important. They said Ms. Kwinana explained the eviction order to them and even offered to talk to the municipality about finding them somewhere else to live.
That makes her seem more human, less like a villain.
It does.
Did they say anything about the extortion claims?
Yes, they talked about a WhatsApp group with about 80 members, including Mrs. Kwinana.
Okay.
They said they used the group to talk about things like rates, electricity, and water payments.
So it was for community stuff.
Right. And they agreed to pay 1,000 Rand each.
And what about those who couldn't pay?
The witness said they were helped out,
That's good to hear.
and they were very clear that the extortion accusations were false.
Okay, so they're directly contradicting the state's claims.
Yeah, they even said that their relationship with Mrs. Kwinana is like family now, and they're not scared of her or her security anymore.
Wow, that's a completely different story. It sounds like they worked things out.
It does. Now, we should also talk about Ms. Kwinana's interview with ENCA.
Oh, right. She gave her own account of things there. What'd she say?
She said her arrest was like something out of a movie, Hollywood style, she called it.
Dramatic.
Yeah, she talked about how many officers there were, how they had balaclavas and rifles, and how they weren't wearing clear police uniforms.
So that's consistent with what she said in court, how scared she was during the arrest.
Exactly. She also went over the history of the land dispute, starting back in 2018, and stressed the importance of that 2020 eviction order, which has been the core of her defense.
Yeah, she keeps coming back to that.
And she explained that she originally hired GPS security for protection because of threats and damage to her property, not to collect money. Okay.
She said the rent agreement came later as a condition for letting the people who left come back to the farm. So she's laying out a clear timeline of events.
It seems like the order of events is very important for her story.
It is. She also brought up the harassment court ruling again.
Right.
She reminded everyone that the magistrate in that case said that people who can't afford to pay rent on private property have to leave.
Okay, so she's using that to justify her actions.
Right.
She also said she thinks the officers who arrested her didn't know about those earlier court orders.
Yeah, which, if true, could mean there was a misunderstanding by the police.
And did you talk about those demolitions again?
Oh yeah, she insisted they were done because the 2020 court order told her to do them. She's basically asking how she can be charged with malicious damage if she was just following a court order.
Okay, so she's sticking to a story. Absolutely. And in the end, she reflected on the whole experience, saying that it shows how even people who think they're acting lawfully can end up in these situations. She also cautioned against celebrating other people's troubles.
It seems like she's presenting herself as someone who tried to follow the law and ended up facing charges, possibly because the authorities didn't understand the whole legal history.
Exactly. And that ENCA interview gives us her personal perspective and reinforces the arguments her legal team made during the bail application.
So let's sum up this deep dive. We'll look at the charges against Yakhe Kwinana, extortion, and malicious damage to property. Her defense is built on that 2020 eviction order, which she says gave her the right to demolish structures, and she claims the rent agreement was consensual and maybe even supported by another court ruling. She also brought up her health concerns.
We also unpack the different accounts of her arrest, with Mrs. Kwinana describing a scary experience and the officers saying she resisted. The legal details of the 2020 order and the later interdict are clearly at the heart of the case. And that testimony from the community member presented a very different picture of the situation, suggesting a mutual agreement rather than extortion.
And Ms. Kwinana's interview on ENCA gave us more insight into her thinking, emphasizing her belief that she was acting legally and that the charges might be a misunderstanding.
Right. This is a complicated case with different interpretations, conflicting stories, and a long-running land dispute at its core.
It raises a lot of questions.
It really does.
So we'll leave you with a thought. Considering the differences in the stories we've heard and the complicated legal aspects of this case, what does it tell us about the challenges of enforcing court orders, especially in land disputes? How can the same events be seen so differently by different people? And what does it all mean for the role of law enforcement when there are multiple court orders, and for the rights of both landowners and people living on the land in these long disputes? We encourage you to keep following this case as it develops.
That's a great point. It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Thank you for joining us on The Unseen Wisdom for this deep dive.
It was great having you all here.
If you found it interesting and thought-provoking, please like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth looks at important issues.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive, uncovering the unseen wisdom behind the headlines.
See you next time.